This video was brought to you in part by the supporters of the AMTV Patreon. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to the Ident Review, the show where we have a good look and chat about the various television idents that we've come to know and love over the years. And for this instalment, we're going to be looking at a wealth of idents from the soon-to-be retired Sky One. Originally launching as simply satellite television in the spring of 1982, Sky would become the oldest non-terrestrial television channel to present in the UK, and many other European territories. In fact, British viewers couldn't access the service until 1983, when new majority stakeholder, Rupert Murdoch of News International, would increase the number of broadcast territories for satellite television, which was eventually renamed to Sky Channel in the January of 1984. The audiences in the UK for this new channel were somewhat limited in its first few years, primarily as satellite technology was still fairly new and highly expensive to the everyday customer. However, as the 80s began to give way to the 90s, satellite dishes started becoming a lot more affordable, and before long, more and more UK viewers were getting their first taste of what satellite television could offer. To coincide with this, Sky Channel would be rebranded to Sky One on the 31st of July 1989. Since then, it has become one of the most dominant satellite channels in the UK, still in service today. Well, not for much longer. It was recently announced that Sky One will cease to be the network's flagship channel on the 1st of September 2021, to give way to a new channel, Sky Showcase. So, as Sky One's time on air draws to a close, I thought it would be apt to look back at a selection of the idents that the channel has aired over the years. We'll go all the way back to 1984, when we first heard about the Sky Channel.
From satellite television in London, this is Sky Channel.
Definitely simple, but very memorable. The setting for this ident is, where else, the sky. We pan down from a lovely starlit night into the brighter skyscape, only to see this huge chrome-laden logo fill up a great majority of our screen, with the word channel appearing somewhat smaller underneath. This logo certainly stands the test of time, and font-wise, it would go relatively unchanged for the next few decades. The chrome metallic-esque texture does make this feel very 1980s, as around this time several companies were experimenting with making their logos look more sophisticated, and as the technology was still expanding, chrome was one of the few options that seemed to meet this requirement. Nevertheless, despite looking a bit dated now, the presentation of this ident holds up remarkably well. I'm fine with the channel moniker having each of its letters spaced out, but the purple hue, whilst being a gorgeous colour, I do feel it doesn't necessarily blend all together that well with both the Sky logo and indeed the background. Had the colour been brighter, more vibrant to match the Sky text, it would maybe feel a little more aligned, although I will stress that this is just a nitpick, I've seen far worse designs. For the 5 years that this sequence was on air, various slogans would pop up from time to time, giving us new variants to observe. These including the somewhat corny Reaching Out to You and the boastful Europe's Number One. However iconic the original Sky Channel ident may be, it was to be soon overshadowed by an even more memorable rebrand. For in 1989, Sky Channel would become Sky One. Now that's what I call an ident. Everything about this sequence just pops right off the screen. The swirling shapes that form the logo, the sprightly music that punctuates throughout, the blend of colours and textures, it's a quintessential example of what makes a fantastic ident. To focus on the music for a second longer, I absolutely adore this composition. It sounds like what Disney were using around this time for their Disney Channel and other media endeavours, and indeed, the Sky variant provokes the same sort of reaction from me as a viewer. It sounds fun, exciting, it sounds like you're about to sit down and embark on some quality programming. Definitely one of my favourite ident scores that I've ever covered on this show. For the actual ident sequence itself, whilst this was the first to carry the moniker Sky One, the structure of the sequence had been seen some months earlier by viewers, as there is a version that carries the old Sky Channel branding, and even earlier than that in what almost feels like a prototype version that has the same music but is structured differently. But back to the one at hand, There are elements that place it firmly in the 90s, but the same could be said with many TV idents of the era. The swirling yet basic 3D shapes must have seemed so exciting back then, and whilst the font of the Sky logo remains the same, carrying over some brand familiarity, it too now has a more 3D appearance. The One text changed over, the first being more like a handwritten signature, a very common 80s motif, whilst the newer variant adopts a more blocky, rigid style of text, which is arguably more readable and recognisable, but again embodies a trend of font that was becoming more common in the 90s. All in all, this is a masterpiece of a television ident, and is one of the best that Sky has ever put to the screens as a network. This sequence would last until around 1993, for when it was swapped out for this new concept.
From the Sky Satellite Network, this is Sky One.
I see what they were going for, but I feel this is a bit of a downgrade. The concept has been altered slightly. We still have a big emphasis on swirling 3D shapes, rousing music, and a striking logo, but I don't know, there's just something about it that feels a bit hollower than its predecessor. The music is mainly comprised of saxophones, which are fantastic instruments, but they aren't provoking that sense of fun and excitement here as the previous ident did. Instead, I feel like I want to make a cup of tea and relax, which is an equally valid effect for an ident to have, but I personally don't find it as impactful. On the ident's design, the Sky logo remains unchanged again, but the One motif is now comprised of 3 differently coloured metallic blocks. And these must have seemed quite something back in 1993, but by today's standards, I'd argue that they've aged far worse than the previous sequences we've looked at so far. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, this ident just isn't that exciting. I'm not overly intrigued as to what's going on, and visually, despite the different colours and blocky motif, it really just doesn't do it for me. Luckily though for me, these idents didn't last all that long. 2 years after their debut, in the year 1995, Sky One would rebrand again, this time adopting a motif that has since become known as the Tombstones.
You're watching Sky One, part of the Sky Satellite Network.
This is Sky One.
Well, this is a trip down memory lane. For those who've been watching for long enough, the Sky Tombstone idents were subjects of one of the earliest episodes of the Ident Review. My opinions may have changed slightly, but if you want to hear my thoughts on the full batch, then I recommend you check out that review. Focusing here on just the One variant, I quite like the tombstone design that Sky went for. The purple hue is a gorgeous primary colour to select for your sequence, and the way in which it's revealed, together with the rousing music, which is excellent, just creates this sense of importance and presence that its predecessor just failed to capture. This ident communicates a sense of style, of significance, and probably, most importantly for the viewer, a sense of quality. The second version of the ident changes the One from letters to a singular numeral, which has its pros and cons. I like the fact it's so abnormally large, no mistaking which channel on the Sky network you switched onto, that's for sure, but on the other hand, it just feels a little less professional than the lettered version. Perhaps it's just because of the huge size or the way it's been designed font-wise, but I personally think the One spelt out in this era is the superior version. And whilst I think I prefer the 1989 ident a little bit more, the Tombstones don't do a bad job by any stretch. They sadly didn't last too long, as in 1997 they were swapped out for something a bit more cool, I guess? Wow, that was a shift. It baffles me how we went from an ident swathed in purples and blues, communicating a sense of elegance and professionalism, to something that feels the exact opposite in every way. The wonderful music of the Tombstones is gone, replaced with something that is certainly very late 90s, but it's a soundscape I've never warmed to, and it always just sounds like a bunch of grown-ups trying to get in touch with the cool music of the day. The white background I find absolutely atrocious. I wouldn't mind if it occupied a small part of the screen, but it's practically the dominant colour throughout. White is such a harsh colour on the eyes, and the fact that the other colours play such a minimal role in this era is a real negative in my book. The yellows, oranges and purples we do get complement each other really well, I just wish they took up most of the image rather than this stark white. The concept itself, almost like a throwback to a lava lamp, may seem a bit odd considering that they were originally fads of the 60s and 70s, but lest we forget, lava lamps did make a rather bizarre resurgence in popular culture in the late 90s and early 2000s. Don't believe me? Well, BBC Two would adopt a lava lamp style ident just a few years later, though granted that was for a 70s themed evening. The Sky One logo is relatively familiar, but again, it's in a much reduced size than most of its predecessors. And ident logos can have a reduced presence and still work, there are many examples, but again, due to the abundance of white, it just gets lost. I'm sure this era will have its fans, but for me, it's definitely one of the worst batch of idents that Sky One has showcased thus far. The public or someone at the company must have thought so too, as just 1 year later, in 1998, another rebrand hit the channel. Let's see what they came up with this time. Well, at least it's an improvement. I'm torn on these idents personally, mainly because due to the wide number of variants, some of them really work, and some of them really don't. To get the negatives out of the way, the sequences set amongst everyday life, showing cityscapes or people getting showered with rain, they just don't provide enough intrigue for me to be memorable. The only thing about them I really like is the pounding Eurodance sounding beats, a particular favourite genre of mine, and one that was seeing its peak in the late 90s and early 2000s. The variants that shine include the one with the freezing motif and the animated style one. The freezing one feels very campy, but also a lot of fun, and whilst it may seem quite out there, it absolutely works, and had we been given different characters like this to lead these sequences, I think they could have been a very memorable set. The animated variant is just beautiful. Everything from the amount of colours that blend and interact so well with each other, to the central character that we're following, it all just works brilliantly, and is my personal favourite of the variants I've shown you from this set. The Sky One logo itself is the element that has arguably undergone the biggest revision. The one lettering is the dominant element, whilst the word Sky has lost its iconic font and has now been reduced to a tiny footnote of the overall logo. Honestly, it's barely visible in some sequences, and considering Sky would incorporate its name so heavily into its idents, I really don't understand this shift. Nevertheless, the turn over to the new millennium was a great time for change and experimentation for all television channels, and I suppose Sky One was just embracing that in its own way. However, as viewers settled into the 2000s, how did the flagship satellite channel adapt? Let's jump to the year 2002 and find out. One word, folks, lazy. These are some of the blandest, most plainly thought out sequences I've seen in a long time. Now, like before, there are many variants to this set, and I can't possibly cover them all here, but the ones I've shown I believe don't demonstrate anything too remarkable. The one set against a real life backdrop, like the one shown in a tunnel, literally just shows cars driving before the Sky One logo appears. Call it simplistic, but it's simple without any substance, it's just a letdown. The sequences set against an orange background are a little more interesting, as they actually feel like they have some sense of a personality, but it isn't by much. Again, this focus on one predominant colour, this time being orange, just feels very out of place for Sky One. Not to mention that orange was the colour of choice for the leading satellite children's channel, Nickelodeon, so it feels more like a knockoff than anything else. Variants like the fly and pong sequences are charming, and they use the line that divides the words Sky and One to an amusing degree, but again, they feel like they've just been slapped together, devoid of anything layered or of substance. The only major positive is that the Sky One logo this time around is an improvement from before. Both words are now equal in size, rather than one being radically smaller than the other, and the mix of one being filled with the colour and the other without works surprisingly well. Some may enjoy the really simple two-tone colour nature of the idents, but for me, I think they're among the worst examples of Sky One sequences. Let's quickly move to 2004, in which Sky One faced another rebrand, and hopefully some more interesting idents.
Don't miss brand new Stargate Atlantis later. Some old friends return, and there's some nice juicy twists as the first of a two-parter kicks off only here on Sky One at 8. Heading for the year 3000 now in Futurama.
That is much, much better. It seems that Sky One found itself again in 2004, as these sequences feel a lot more creative and are infinitely more interesting than their immediate predecessor. The first two variants focus on various objects occupying the space, against a one-tone colour background. Sometimes the items can be a little tricky to identify, but overall I think the motif works surprisingly well. It's Sky One embracing the futuristic robotic theme that was such a big trend in the mid-2000s. Just look at items such as Robo Sapien or the sleek metallic nature of the original line of iPods, and you'll see what I mean. I'm not over the moon about the new Sky One logo. The word Sky remains unchanged from before, but the one has been broken into pieces and I can see what they were going for, but for me it just looks a little bit awkward and slapdash. In their final year of airing, in 2008, new variants were introduced that focused on some rotating 3D shapes, which, upon closer inspection, are the three pieces that make up the word One in the channel's logo. Whilst the shapes look really nice, especially when watching in HD, this is one of those examples where, beyond the appeal of the 3D models, there really isn't anything here to take in. The first two variants of the set that I showed may be a lot less striking in terms of visuals, but at least there was some substance to delve into and enjoy. Here, after the initial wow factor of the rotating logo pieces, the appeal all but ends, at least in my view. But this was the age in which many channels were gearing up to switch to full-time HD broadcasting, and what better way to display HD visuals than with a few, visually simple 3D objects? Serves its purpose, I guess, but I'm glad it didn't last long. As later in 2008, Sky One was rebranded again, now swapping out the lettered one for just a single numeral. Now this is more like it. Sky One seems to be finally finding that sense of fun again. There are several variants, but I want to focus on the logo first. The word Sky seems to be absent for the most part in these sequences, which at first I was surprised by, but on reflection, I think they work much better without it. And this is down to the numeral 1 that has been introduced. It's the first major time Sky One had adopted the digit since the late 90s, and whereas there it felt a bit out of place, this one feels right at home. In the three different examples, the 1 is being used to great effect. I love the result when a car hits it in the Twister scene. The light blue shards of the 1 floating off in slow motion look absolutely gorgeous as it stands as an unbreakable monolith around this raging wind. The second sequence, at a funfair, exemplifies the more light-hearted nature of Sky One, with several smaller digits being crushed in a game of whack-a-mole. The little blue shards that spread from the hammer feel tangible and like they have some weight to them. It's just a really fun use of the channel logo. The third and final example I find so interesting, as we only see the 1 for a brief moment before it adopts a sentient life and begins to envelop this man in several small little crystal shards. I'm a big fan of the idea of making Idents somewhat sentient, whether that's for a charming or dramatic effect, and this one feels full of mystery, like we're only getting a small glimpse into it and what it can really do, and if anything, I wish there was so much more of it. For those who are interested, there is a Simpsons themed Ident from this era starring Itchy and Scratchy, and if you want to hear my thoughts on that, check out the Ident review episode that was all about the family from Springfield. Overall, these Sky One Idents are a great reimagining of the channel's identity, and are actually some of my favourites from the last 20 years. Nothing lasts forever though, and in 2011, these beauties were sadly swapped out for some newcomers, so let's see how they held up.
Will Young and Cara Toynton star in Sky Living's haunting new drama Bedlam, and Monday at 10 prepare for an all-new spooky experience as a brand new episode is revealed.
Prohibition has just been passed and it's like ringing the dinner bell for every mobster, loan shark and hired gun around. Martyn Scorsese's Boardwalk Empire starts tonight at 9 on our new channel Sky Atlantic HD, channel 108.
A nice evolution, but not as good as their predecessors. What I do like about these idents is that they use the slice of life idea in a very calming manner. Whereas before in the late 90s that approach just felt very slapped together, this one feels controlled and very elegant in how it's presented. The one numeral features again, though this time, rather than giving the impression that it's some sort of sentient life form, it's now just a stationary object that so happens to be part of these worlds. In the first sequence, it's purely a reflective mirror, which blends nicely with the surrounding elements. In the rain variant, I like how people immediately try and duck underneath it, using it as a kind of shelter. It's charming to say the least and exemplifies how channel idents can be utilised when placed into real-life situations. Despite their strengths, however, I feel they lack some of that wonder and intrigue that the 2008 set had. Whereas the one had some kind of a personality, here it just serves as a motionless object, more of a statue than being of sentience. And whilst it works, I just find the former more interesting than what viewers were presented with here in 2011. The Sky One logo makes a return on screen, occupying centre towards the end of sequences, and whilst the new look is memorable, dare I say it looks a little bland? Maybe it's the shape used or the two-tone colours, but it just feels very basic. Almost like a preset you'd find in a design program. This style would stick around until 2016, when the channel would be rebranded again, so let's see what they had to offer viewers.
Well, if you think Brian Finch is looking bright and shiny, check us out. No NZT required. New Limitless is tomorrow at 9 on Sky One. Barry Allen's been taking tips from some of our other DC dudes as he dabbles in a little high-speed time travel tonight at 8 in brand new The Flash. It's one of my life goals to be in a power couple like Claire and Phil Dunphy. Luckily, my other half is totally on board with it. See Modern Family the season so far with Catch-Up TV.
This rebrand feels like a mixed bag to me. On the one hand, I like the fact that we've returned to the idea of a one embodying a personality, bouncing about the screen with a sense of fun. It's actually quite akin to the personality twos that adorned BBC Two in the early 2000s. I also love that with every move this one makes, a shard or splash of colour erupts into the stark white background. My favourite being the tornado variant. Seeing all these swirls of colour flying about looks truly magnificent, especially when viewed in HD. And whilst I love the mix of colours and the personality that the one embodies, the return of a white background is a major misfire if you ask me. Like when it was used in the late 90s, the emptiness that we see here is just off-putting. Had more things been placed in the background, however big or small, it would have softened this criticism, but even with the one moving around and wide doses of colour that do eventually emerge, it really does feel a bit of an empty sequence. Viewers would only get to see these variants for a single year, before the channel would revert back to using a lettered one as opposed to a numeral. So let's see how this impacted Sky One upon their debut in 2017.
Officer, it wasn't me. How many times have they heard that one, I wonder? Strong language now, with the Force Essex.
Russell Howard finds the stories that give you all of the festive feels while also putting the people in their place who are really roasting your chestnuts. His Christmas Hour is here Thursday at 10.
I'm not convinced. We've swapped out a one with personality to go back to lettering, which admittedly would be a lot more cumbersome to animate, but not impossible. The first couple of variants are very simple concepts, and they do work to a degree, but the wash of two colours, blue and white, just make these sequences feel very clinical and extremely drab. I know that's a personal view, but these two colours don't communicate anything exciting or intriguing for an audience member to engage with. A better use and example of how to utilise the two colours would be the Christmas ident. Here we see the Sky One logo being adapted for a whole manner of items, including snowflakes, the bristles on a tree, and more. Whilst it would have been great to see even more colours injected into it, the use of the logo makes for a charming and quite creative sequence, and I wish they would have done this more for the era. The earlier idents feel more like Channel 4 knockoffs, to be honest, especially the one where several Sky logos are appearing to be clumping together. It's not very inspired, or at least it doesn't feel like it. These idents would remain in place for a few years, before the channel received one last batch of new tweaked sequences in the year 2020. So bringing it around to the end of our journey, let's have a look at some of the sequences currently going out on Sky One.
As we enter the final stretch of Season 7, it's a good time to get caught up on the blacklist, especially with loudmouths like me around. I'll accidentally spoil it in passing. The latest ep is over on Catch Up Now. Violence now on Sky One, it's the blacklist.
Not much of a shift, but I do prefer this, to be honest. We still have just two colours adorning the screen and the logo has been ever so slightly altered, but the concepts employed here work so much better than the 2017 batch. I particularly love the domino style sequence, in which several ones fall together to eventually reveal the full logo. Dominoes is an age-old game and an age-old concept in the use of television mediums, but when done right like this, they still carry over the same effect and intrigue to the viewer. I would have loved even more colours to be utilised so that the falling of the dominoes would have been even more engaging, but alas, even with just the blue and the white, it does look good. The second sequence I'm a bit less enamoured with. It's a cute concept, sort of like a leaf blower effect, but again, I can't help but make an immediate comparison to some of the stings used on Channel 4. Perhaps because they're both fairly recent implementations on their respective channels is why I'm making the connection, but I just find the Sky version a little tired and uninspired. And to be honest, if the domino variant was the only one used for Sky One in this era, I would absolutely be happy with that. But alas, we're up to date. Squarely in 2021, reaching the last few weeks of Sky One's life on air. Over the last 40 years, the Sky Network has grown and evolved into a juggernaut of a satellite empire, cementing its place within the television landscape. Its idents have similarly grown and evolved, from a very simple chrome-plated logo in a dusky sky, to the 90s trend of 3D shapes, to the late 2000s obsession with simplicity, for better or for worse. But through it all, for the most part at least, Sky One has remained a visual identity that viewers recognise and respect. And even though some of their mainstays were complete misfires, most TV channels experiment with the look that represents them, and for even daring to change things up the way that they did as the years went by, Sky One is a trailblazer, and it will be a shame to see it go. Will Sky Showcase even come close to having the look and the impact of its predecessor? Only time will tell. But for now, we bid a fond farewell to Sky One, and give thanks to nearly 40 years of great television memories. And so that brings us to the end of another episode of the Ident Review. If you enjoyed this look at a wide variety of Sky One idents, then please leave a like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel for lots more ident related content. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Well, that does bring us to the end of another day here on AMTV. We do hope you enjoyed the programme, and a special thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and to everyone who's tuned in. Until the next broadcast, we wish you a good night.